I'm going to get right to introducing Alan, our keynote speaker, who I feel like we're really fortunate to have here to bring in some outside perspective at this point in Nashville's urban narrative. Alan, like I said, is from Vancouver. He's recognized as a leading thinker on urban issues. His experience with large mixed-use projects, unique sustainable architecture, and public space design all contribute to a unique approach to city making, and is a frequent contributor to conferences, roundtables in the US and Canada where urban thinking is being reshaped. Alan's involvement in Vancouver, although there's more, he currently is the chair of the ULI chapter there in Vancouver. He's the former chair of the Planning Commission at the City of Vancouver and currently serves on the Mayor's Affordable Housing Task Force. Having contributed to projects in many jurisdictions, including Beijing, Los Angeles, Vancouver, San Francisco, Portland, and New York, Alan is the current managing partner of the Vancouver studio of Dialogue, the past chair of the Vancouver City Planning Commission, and the chair of the Vancouver District Council of the Urban Land Institute. In addition to the current design projects in Edmonton, Los Angeles, Memphis, and Vancouver, Alan is helping to reshape the planning process itself with an eye towards making uniquely mixed, people-oriented, sustainable communities that adapt and prosper through time. Did you write that? So let's welcome Alan Boniface.
So thank you, Andy, for those kind words that I did not write. I feel very privileged to be here. I think Nashville, as you all know, is emerging as a pretty cool place within North America. I had the opportunity over the last 2 days to tour a fair amount of the city, not everything, obviously, and I was very impressed by a lot of the things that are happening throughout the region, and I think there's a lot of great things to build on here. I also have to thank everybody for the incredible hospitality that I've received. I've heard about Southern hospitality and experienced it to some degree, but this has been very impressive, so thank you to everybody for that. The other thing I should mention is that what you're going to see today is basically a collection of thoughts of what I've experienced in my career. It's by no means the answer to anything in particular. It's simply sharing some of my thoughts. So I really hope that after we finish, we open to some serious discussion and questions. I look forward to that. But in the meantime, I'll share with you some of these thoughts. I think, not to get too serious out of the gate, because I don't want to be too serious, but I think it's really important that we step back and think about where we are in the Western world especially, but in the world in general. These are extraordinary times, and I think we need to think differently. We need to act differently. And we need to think about the world we create, the built world, very, very differently. And I don't think that anybody here misses that point. So it's something to keep in mind as we go through the discussion. So this talk is basically structured around 3 parts. The first part, I'm going to stretch some of my thinking about lessons that may have been learned from Vancouver. For those of you that don't know Vancouver, Vancouver is a pretty unique place. It's very dense, extremely dense, and because of the advantages, I guess, of growing up in an environment like that, you learn a lot. So Vancouver will be the first part. The second part will be a discussion of urban magnets, which is, simply put, a way to think about creating communities within a larger realm of a city. So it's not the panacea of everything. It's simply a way to look at communities and design of communities. And then finally, I'm going to share some examples and some thoughts about how that might apply in Nashville and how our firm has applied it in some other places. So just some very quick background to Vancouver. This is the Pacific Ocean on the left, Vancouver Island in the center of this image. And I'm just going to zoom in on Vancouver to give you an idea of the context. That yellow line represents a mountain range to the north of the city that is 5,000 feet in height. So there's a pretty serious boundary to the north of the city. That red line is the Canada-US border. And yes, I can see the US from my house. That's not a Sarah Palin thing. Just as a sidelight, 90% of Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border, so we really like you guys. That blue line is the inner boundary of the Pacific Ocean. And this little green circle is what we call the Agricultural Land Reserve, which is a preserved area to grow food for our region and cannot be developed. As if we didn't have enough constraints, we're getting down to a very small window of land. That red circle is the city of Vancouver. And just an aerial shot of that to give you some context. That's the downtown core, which is about 926 acres. To the left of this, I don't have it on the slide, is Stanley Park, which is a green preserved space equal in size to the downtown core. And the rest of the region in the shot is what I just showed you in the previous slide. I'm circling this one little piece here because Granville Island, which is noted in the bottom as a 35-acre site, is a really important site in the city and a site that our firm has been intimately involved with. And many of the things I'm sharing with you today, we learned on that site. So as we go through the talk, it'll be important to remember where that is. The other really important thing when you look at Vancouver is that we, like everywhere else, had a significant design for a freeway system. To the top of this image is the body of water you would have just seen at the top of the previous image. And the downtown core is on the left bottom area. For any of you that have been to Vancouver, you probably realize that this never happened. We have no freeways in the city of Vancouver. And that whole area on the left where the red lines are is our waterfront, which is now a completely engaged waterfront. Our convention center is there, and the city meets the water. It doesn't have a barrier. It's a very, very important original move in the city. But Vancouver has its problems. The downtown east side of Vancouver is the most impoverished local area in the country, in Canada, and we have some serious issues with drugs and prostitution and that sort of thing. So often when I travel, people, they're waiting for the beauty of Vancouver, which you'll see some of that, but I think it's really important to put Vancouver in context. It's not the perfect place. It has its issues. So one of the things we do share with Nashville is that we have a lot of migration into the city. It sounds like we're pretty close in numbers. Between 25 and 30,000 people arrive in the city of Vancouver every year, and from what I understand, that's pretty close to the Nashville numbers as well. That creates a lot of great things. It creates growth and opportunity, but it also creates the opportunity for mistakes, and we've made some. But on the other side of the coin, this is called the West End of Vancouver. It was developed in the 1950s and 60s. And it basically looks the same today as it does in this slide. It's a very dense area. At the time, it was the fourth most dense part of any city in North America, and that was a long time ago. But we learned to live with density in Vancouver partly because of this area. We also did a lot of interesting projects. This is Granville Island that I referred you to, and I'll talk more about this later. But the point here is that when projects are done right, and I'll explain what I mean by right as I go through the discussion here, if they're made for people, they're not based on formal architectural moves first, they're made for people first. These projects last. This project is 40 years old, and it continues to attract more people through time to its site. Another site in Vancouver is Robson Square. This was an interesting project because it was originally a site for a very large essentially state, in our case province, provincial building, which would house provincial offices and the law courts. The original design was a 60-story tower on one end of this very long site. And what happened was something quite different. And I'm a big believer that towers can be the right response, but in this case it wasn't. And instead, everything was put on its side. Most of it was put underground. All the black box spaces were put underground. And the top became a public plaza that is experienced by everybody at all parts of the year. And it has continued to evolve. This shot is from the 2010 Winter Olympics, and the site took on a whole new life during the Olympics. There will be a couple of themes in what I'm talking about. One will be public spaces. I think Vancouver has done public space as well as any city that I know of, and it's a real important contributor to the success of any city. We also, in our downtown especially, and this is quite surprising for some people, we build for families. We ensure that all the ingredients for families to occupy buildings and live in the downtown are met. We build daycares, we build play spaces, we build a lot of 3-bedroom units, and the city insists that in any large development, all of those things take place. The daycares and schools are partly funded by the development, so the developer actually pays a fee to the city as they build to help finance these things. Another theme of what I'll be talking about is the street. I think the street is the most important public space, and with a ULI audience in front of me, I'm sure most of you know that. I'm a big fan of ULI, by the way. But in Vancouver, this has been taken to a very high level. You cannot get a project through the planning department unless they meticulously look at the ground level and how it meets the street, even down to the inch of how things are spaced from the street, how residential and retail meet the street. And here in Nashville, there are some examples. I think there's many great streets in Nashville. This one I pick out because it's interesting that wandering around yesterday, we saw that the left side of the street was very active and engaged, and the right side of the street was a blank wall. It sort of gave both examples in one crystal shot. And there's some other sites, I've participated in buildings all over the place, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. This is an example, and I hope I'm not offending anybody in the audience, but this is exactly an example of what not to do. Another thing that's happened in Vancouver is we've learned how to build density quickly and economically. It's not a place where money isn't made. It certainly is a place where money is made, and we all participate in that. This is a shot because people that are in the building industry always ask me, well, how does this happen? This is a floor slab. All of the rebar, the electrical, you can see mechanical air handling ducts, thin ones in this shot. The plumbing, sprinklers, everything are cast into a 7.5-inch concrete floor slab in a seismic zone in 6 days. So this will have concrete on it shortly after the shot. They'll fly the forms to the next floor and they'll do it all over again. So we build a floor every 6 days, but we're also building a lot of the systems into that. So as much as Vancouver is an unaffordable place, which is one of the byproducts of its success, there is a construction methodology that's pretty successful. However, my point here is that in Vancouver, we're not innovating now. We love this way of building, so we do it over and over again. And I'm not sure that's the best recipe. There needs to be more variety. As you can appreciate here in Nashville as well, there's an urgency sometimes to sales. People are lining up. I've heard that's happened here on occasion as well. In Vancouver, that's generally been okay, but I think the lesson here is that just because something is needed to happen fast or that there is urgency in the sales part of things, we can't rush too much. We need to do the things we need to do to make the city good from the outset. This is actually a series of trends, but it's really just an important slide for people to understand. As we've densified the downtown core of the city of Vancouver, the population in the last 7 to 8 years has increased by 75% in the downtown core. The job space has increased by 26%. And the people entering the downtown to work or for other reasons has increased by 15%. However, the vehicles, the cars entering the downtown has decreased by 25%. So what happens is that over 2/3 of the population that moves around the downtown core does so in ways without a car. So back to the freeway scenario, I know as a planner and architect that you think of all the developments you've ever worked on. One of the first things you figure out is it close to transportation? How does that work, et cetera? But Vancouver's a living example of taking all of that away and saying, do you think people are still going to find a way to move around if we don't have that freeway? Well, the answer is yes. And it's a very successful way to do so. One of the things that's not successful, and as an architect, I speak in Vancouver about this all the time and people start throwing things at me, but I find Vancouver to have above average architecture, but too much of the same thing. And I think we're really going to regret this in time. This is one of many shots I could have shown you where we just have a wall of glass everywhere. Luckily, if you zoom down and look at the green space at grade, the public realm, the streets in Vancouver are fantastic, but the buildings are less so. And similarly, there's a public walkway around Vancouver which is over 20 miles of continuous public access to the waterfront, our seawall. And one of the things that I think doesn't work about that, it sounds fantastic and it is fantastic, but one of the things that doesn't work is that the normal grit of a city, those places that happen that aren't so sterilized and clean, don't really happen. You know, there's the odd restaurant like this, which is kind of fun and kind of cool, but it doesn't work as well as it should. So Vancouver's lacking grit in my mind. It's very shiny, but it's lacking grit. This is a really important slide. When I talked about how things meet the street, residential meeting the street is critical that it be done right in order for there to be a proper transition between public space and private space. And moreover, one of the statistics I've not shown you is that the crime rate in downtown Vancouver, as we've densified and done these things, has decreased by more than 50%. And this is one of the major reasons, because people occupy these little stoops. They hang out here and they look at the street. If anybody knows Jane Jacobs, and I'm sure most of you do, that was one of her philosophies, was to have eyes on the street. And it works. It definitely works. So some lessons quickly from other places. As I've noted, the streets are critical, but I find that in many cities, and I think Nashville's wandering down that path as well, that streets are becoming a design element that's getting a bit formulaic. We have green streets and complete streets, and they're great. They have their place. But there's also an opportunity for a lot more creativity. These are some shots from Montreal and Quebec City in Quebec, where these streets are actually multifunctional. They are car streets sometimes, they're pedestrian plazas at other times. In the summer, they're obviously play spaces. They're also gathering places for concerts and all sorts of things. So I think there's an opportunity when a city like Nashville is redoing a lot of its infrastructure to look at some of the streets and say, here's an opportunity for something really cool and local. This is also a shot from Montreal. For those of you that may not have been to Montreal, it's a very cool place, very creative architecture and urban design. This particular apparatus in the winter serves as a temporary art display with art hanging from it. And in the warmer months, obviously, it's used for people, adults and kids, to swing on. Very cheap structure, but something that animates a public space very well. This is actually part of Granville Island that I showed you previously. Granville Island is roughly 40 years old, and when our firm designed it, one of the things that was critical was to keep employment on the site and keep the real history of the site working. So this is actually a concrete batching plant that is in the center of those glass towers that I showed you on the same waterway that we've been fighting for since the day we did it 40 years ago, to keep it there. And I'll explain a little further later why. But essentially, jobs, real jobs, blue-collar jobs downtown. The working port is still there. We haven't sterilized it. And all of these barges that pull up with aggregate, they animate the port. They're part of the play of the water and the movement of boats. So density. Density is something, as I said, in Vancouver we're not making any more land, so we don't have a lot of choice, and there's a lot of learning in that. But I thought these statistics would be pretty interesting. When you talk about things like crime rates going down, Manhattan is another very good example, obviously an extreme example, but don't be afraid of density. And it can come in many forms. It doesn't have to be high-rise forms, but don't be afraid of density. And in terms of greenhouse gases, I think most of you would be aware of these numbers, but this is a map of Vancouver where the downtown core is now getting down to the kind of carbon output that we feel we need to be a sustainable place, and that's 1 ton per person. And jobs are a very, very key component of that, because you can a lot of people can walk to employment. I'm going to keep mentioning this over and over again. We do a lot of different things to our public realm. This is a project that we worked on where we put a coffee shop on a medium-sized plaza, and the art piece behind that is actually a rotating piece of art from the Vancouver Art Gallery that rotates through every 6 to 8 months. So it's a simple idea, but it's important. Just down the way from that, we also designed this little stage, which I think for those of you in a music-oriented city would be an important thing to do. So that we've created opportunities for this in Vancouver, obviously in the summer months, because most of the time it's hammering rain. But this is something, these are actually free concerts put on by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a federal entity. And that transition from public to private. So I showed you the previous slide of that, which showed you the spaces. What I want you to see in here is that there is intentionally, by design, a few steps up. And that's actually mandated by the City of Vancouver. So anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 feet is what we have to do to create that transition. And it sounds kind of weird, but when you see it working, you understand. This is a project where we tried to push the boundaries for the city a bit, and the slide on the right gives you a bit of context. This building is up against a off-ramp of a bridge, and on that off-ramp is a ton of graffiti art, and it happens to be great graffiti art. So when we did these units, the developers was asking us, how are we going to sell these things? And we weren't sure, but we thought we'd do our best. So first of all, they're vaulted units so that they get more light and there's the ability to go up on them. But down at grade in the left-hand slide, what we did is we created, at these same little stoops, we created an opportunity for graffiti art. So when you buy one of these units, you can participate in the art of the street, or you can choose to put a piece of glass over that little thing and there is no graffiti. But we wanted to give people the opportunity to be there for a reason and to animate the street in a unique way. These are the same glassy towers you saw before, but you probably don't see them at first because you're too busy looking at the public realm. This is the Olympic Village in Vancouver, which has fantastic public space, chairs for people to hang out on that swivel, a lot of great urban design. And within the city, there's a lot of variety of open spaces. And when I walked around Nashville over the last couple of days, I realized that there are a lot of places where there are parking lots, there's undeveloped land, and there's the ability to participate if there's a bigger picture thinking happening to create a lot of great public space in Nashville. I mentioned the lessening of automobile trips in the downtown core to the point where we have made major swaths of real estate available for biking. And this is probably an average day. We are ramping up biking, but we're not where the city wants to be yet. We also, because of this density, are now available to add, or are now able to add a mass transit into the picture. So we have an underground system downtown. We have a direct train to the airport now. And we also have a lot of other modes of transportation, trains to the suburbs and buses as well. But the densifying of the downtown core has been critical to making that work. We're also, because we're running out of land, we're learning how to densify single-family neighborhoods as we sort of march out from the downtown neighborhoods. This is a very good example of an old, on the left is actually an old car garage that's being turned into 2 units, and then on the right is some additional units that have been added to that. And I think, one of the other lessons, I saw some very interesting architecture over the last few days. I think experimentation and different types of design are really, really important to a city, and I would encourage Nashville to continue down that path, but also make sure that the street is working. So the second part is this phrase, urban magnets, which everywhere I go now, that's all anybody talks about, and it's only really a little piece of what I want to talk about, but it's an important piece. But it's not the answer to everything. What it is, though, is a way of looking at design, and for the architects in the room, I was trained just like you. I came out of school building formal palaces to my own ego. But I soon realized that growing up in a place, that wasn't the best way to contribute to where I lived, and it wasn't the best way to contribute to other places that I'm now working in. There's so much more to do, and it's very trite to say it's all about people, but hopefully by the time I'm finished, you'll understand that it's not just a phrase, it's actually something that's very meaningful. This is an example of something that is not a magnet, and I don't think it's actually that much about people either. We all are familiar with malls. The idea of malls is that it's kind of like bait. They want to get you in, they want you to stay as long as you can, and they want to try and sell you something. So it's not real vitality, it's kind of shopping vitality. And I think people are seen as prey in that situation. And I use this example because I think we can all relate to that example. And it's an extreme example, obviously. So quickly, some background. I think a lot of developments, in my mind, and maybe failure is a different definition for everybody, but for me, I think places fail when they don't have vitality. Over time, that means probably less rent or less rented spaces. It means that a city may find itself with holes in it again because something hasn't been done that creates vitality, and you may need to redevelop that again. That's what I mean by failure. So I think too often what we do is we, especially from the development side, we want to get in and get out and make money. And part of my argument is you can do that and do everything else as well. In fact, if I would have brought some of my Vancouver developer friends with me, they would say they've made more money because they paid attention to things like streets and the public realm. They can charge more rent. They have renters all the time. One of the things Magnets looks at is that I think too much in North America, we've kind of thought of places by weird segmentations through time. And as I've gotten older, I'm pretty clear that the younger generation doesn't think of the world that way, and good for them. And I think it's something to learn from. Magnets is very much about crossing through all of those. And what it does is it wants to look at subcultures. In other words, the things that we do together that cross all boundaries of sex, race, and any other demographic category. We do things together because it's cool and it's fun. And that is an opportunity to create a place and create a community. So obviously, previous forms of, or previous models of development have followed this type of approach. What I'm talking about is something quite different. This is another example. I have many slides in my library of places like this where you kind of look at this and you get it. I mean, I didn't tell all the people to leave. They just weren't there when we took the shot, right? In the architecture, you can argue one way or the other if it's good or bad. But at the end of the day, this retail is not working. There's a whole dimension between the curb and the building, which is critical. And obviously having some tenants would be critical too. But, it's a shining example of how things can fail. So when we look at demographics, we look at it quite differently. And a lot of people relate to this particular slide. It crosses all boundaries and makes sure that we are inclusive of everyone in a society. And the most important thing about what I'm talking about generally, and certainly about urban magnets, is that it has to be local. It's not about bringing in something from the outside. It's not about bringing in a brand or a store or some other entity. It's about knowing what your place is about and responding to it. And this is just one slide of many great places I saw in Nashville that do that. I mean, you would not see this street in almost any other city. And it was active and people were hanging out. It was a good street. So, contrasting slides. I don't have to say much about those. This looks like it could be Nashville, but this is actually Granville Island as well. A lot of festivals, a lot of people hanging out and doing interesting things, much more connected and dynamic. And in any city, I can't remember which American city this is, but there are always activity-based things that happen in a city that are opportunities to think about and build buildings, build structures, build master plans around, so that activity becomes the genesis of a place. So what is that? So basically what I'm talking about is developing projects that are essentially built around an activity where people can do what they love to do together. Quickly to summarize that, those five aspects of what we're talking about are really, really critical when we're trying to drive an activity node within a city. And they all have to be there. Otherwise, it's not doing what we want it to do. If you think back to communities, older communities, European, Asian communities, they typically would have this without somebody having to try to orchestrate it. So why retail and why local retail? Because it connects people to places. It's something that we do, especially in North America. We love to shop. And certainly when it's food-based, it's even got another level to it. Production is the key piece, however. This is the piece that we've lost. And I think it's an opportunity to restore our economies. I think it's an opportunity to restore our local economies. And I think it's critical to the way we function as a society to have production come back. And production, by the way, is changing. And I'll talk about that a little bit near the end. We will be creating things that by ourselves that we didn't used to be able to do. Education is important. It brings younger people. It makes sure that the demographic spectrum is complete, and it brings a vitality. And it also keeps on brand, because if you're educating about the magnet, then you're reinforcing the idea. Events obviously establish on the ground the brand or the magnet as well, so that we reinforce in the community that this place is about something. And then the form is the last thing. And I'm not standing here saying that we shouldn't have great architecture at all. I'm just saying that the architecture needs to understand what it's doing. So quickly, people always ask me about other places around the world, so I picked some that you might know. The Meatpacking district in New York City is an emerging neighborhood, an awesome neighborhood that has a pretty complete art magnet, and I'm sure as it evolves, we'll have other aspects as well. But my question is what happened to meatpacking? It's a bit like the concrete plant. These are things that we need to make a place work. It shouldn't be moved out to, Nantucket or something. I don't know where it would go, but it should be part of that fabric. It's part of the history, and there's a way to do it that would be pretty cool. The Distillery District is a part of Toronto. It's an older area that has been evolving over 25 years. As we've been assessing it through time, it didn't sort of qualify as a complete magnet, but it does now. Just added a theater school and performances year-round. So it's now become a blossomed art magnet, and it's working very well. It's also working on having a food magnet. Food, by the way, is almost always one of the components of a great place. Venice Beach, for those of you that have been there, is an example of an incomplete place. I mean, it has sort of things that we associate with it as being a place, but it's missing some of the ingredients that I'm talking about, notably production. So finally, what does this mean for cities? It means a lot of great things. I think Nashville could benefit from some of this thinking in some of the neighborhoods. Nashville is a destination. It does have a brand. It is recognized, but that could come down to the local level in many, many places throughout the city. And it is scalable. It's scalable from a small building scale up to the size of a precinct. So just some thoughts as I sort of build towards the end here. This is moving into the third part of the speech here today. People were asking me over the last few days, what's here that we can build on? Well, I think, as I said, the local neighborhoods have great vitality. Germantown is a fantastic example. But what I see is a kind of private development-oriented hodgepodge of things, which may work really well. But I think that the planning departments, the oversight, ULI itself, can play a role in looking at how a community is evolving and saying, well, do we have all the pieces we need here? Do we have the interface at the street? Do we have some of the things that are going to make this place a great place through time? And make sure that conversation is had as a place like Germantown evolves. And that includes making sure that the pieces fit together. There's some really cool things in a place like Germantown where there are old industrial sites, some of which seem to be retained and some of which are not. But I think it's worth the question, can we retain more and more? And then finally, almost finally, enabling experimentation and relaxing regulations. This is a really important role that the city and other agencies can play. And we're not talking about throwing out codes. We're just saying there's an opportunity to think about certainly production uses in a way that hasn't been done for years. And of course, the street edge is critical. And finally, I've noted this idea of the local DNA. That takes a lot of work to find out what in your neighborhood, what in your city is something that will work. On the other hand, I think Brett will speak later to the fact that he, in East Nashville, has built a number of buildings that were occupied before he finished them because they were incubator spaces of exactly what I'm talking about. So sometimes if you build it, they will come. So just some quick thoughts on some other things that I think are important to share with you. We did have this right a long time ago. When we first settled North America, we actually built these little towns that weren't car-based, and they had all sorts of weird things at the grade level where you would have a blacksmith, you would have a food store, you'd have a saloon. All those things were there, and there wasn't a lot of questioning. They knew instinctively that the main floor needed to have those things for people to hang out. And above that, they built hotels and residences. That's actually what we're talking about. And of course, other places around the world have done this exceptionally well. This is obviously a street in France. It was obviously designed long before the car, and it is a very, very dense part of this city, and obviously has that whole grade engagement in spades. So what happened? Well, we all fall in love with these. And I'm, just to be clear, I'm one of the person who loves these too. So it's just something of our, especially older generations, that is part of who we are. And it's an amazing invention. But what we've done, I think, is we've serviced this vehicle above people. We've thought of design to make this work first. And it shouldn't be first, it should be way down the list. So we've built places that we need to drive to, great places, communities, neighborhoods, all of which have great attributes to them. But as I started with the first slide, I think we need to rethink how this is working, or if it's working at all, because frankly, we're subsidizing this type of development, and we need to think about our core areas much more. So we need to stop splitting everything apart, in my mind, and instead we need to crush everything together. That's really what I'm talking about. We need to not be making exceptions. And all of that can be local and very unique, and has to be, in fact, to thrive through time. And then we need to get down to the small details. So everything I've showed you about that curb edge, the distance to the building, how residences and retail meet the street is actually as critical as the big moves. So applying the key lessons, the public realm is critical, making great public realm places for people, street engagement, with the right dimensions, a mix of uses, all uses. But you guys know that. ULI knows that. ULI preaches this all the time. It's one of the great things that ULI does, is it makes sure that those things are front and center. But what do we not talk about? Well, I think we don't talk about zoning properly. Zoning is a creation basically paralleling the car. And what we've done is formalize segregation with zoning. And I'm not saying zoning doesn't have its place, and I'm not saying there aren't some uses that can't be in the core of a city or next to a home. I'm just saying we need to take our minds and open them up a bit and rethink that. We also don't often think about local, really. We think about bringing in the Gap or McDonald's or Starbucks or something, because that's the thing that's going to work. That'll make the corner animated. And I don't think it's actually the best way to animate the corner. When you think of your city and you think of the great places within your city, I bet you 9 times out of 10, it's a great corner restaurant, it's a great corner coffee shop that is from somebody here that created it. It has more character, it has more life. And the other thing we don't talk about at all is jobs. Local jobs, jobs in the city, and creating buildings and structures and communities that enable that. So what I'm saying is, think about magnets as a tool, as a way to help you think about those things, and arrive at making nodes within the city that are locally based. This is a huge issue. It's not just a local issue. Obviously, we've all gone through a major recession, and we understand that there's something missing or wrong in the economic system. I believe that actually creating great cities can help that. So I mentioned earlier that jobs are changing, work is changing. And one of the ways it's changing is that if you read a number of articles that are coming out lately, and The Economist has a series on this, there is another industrial revolution coming. And it's less mechanized, it's less large, it's more personal. And just some quick statistics to make us understand that. This machine is going to change everything. I'm sure most of you are aware of this machine. But as this machine evolves, I saw one on the plane now in the Sky Mall. There's a digital printer for $1,400, I think. So it's here, and it's going to change the way we think of stuff. It's certainly going to change the way production takes place. So now when you think of micro spaces and little incubator spaces that are on the street below a residence, it's quite a different thought than it used to be. So I just stole this quote from yesterday, wandering. I don't know if it was you, Andy. Somebody came up with this. I think it was from Detroit originally is where I heard this was coming from. So I think it's absolutely right. It's exactly on topic. The other thing about putting everything together is that it is the greenest thing you can do. It's absolutely the greenest thing you can do, because everything is walkable, or most things are walkable, and it changes the way cities act. It's also economically viable, and it allows for entrepreneurialism. And this is an example from Brett's project in East Nashville, where all of these spaces are incubator spaces, tiny little retail spaces where local people are finding a place to do their business, and hopefully they will expand later and move out of here, but they had a place to start. So the second point here is something that cities often ask is, how do we do this? Mixed use is tough, it's messy, there's codes. One of the things we're doing in projects that we work on is trying to legally parcel an air parcel for the upper floors that disconnects those. So just to finish off, some projects that we've been working on. I don't have a lot of slides of this because I don't want to stand here and show what our firm is doing, but I do want to use these examples just to illustrate that these things can be done. So Granville Island, you've witnessed some of. A major master plan, a complete junkyard of a site with very little functioning parts 40 years ago. But a before and after shot. We retained almost every original structure on the site. And that's another way to sort of take the ego out of the architecture and make sure that you're using things that are there. So that's a before and after shot. It's become a very famous place. It's published all around the world. New York's think tank, Projects for Public Spaces, has named it the best public space, the best neighborhood in North America. And the jobs. The concrete trucks actually are a huge part of this place. They drive through the area, they paint their trucks to represent the island, and they go out and advertise the fact that they're from Granville Island. So another project that's very dear to my heart is in Memphis, just down the road. We're applying our thinking there to the Sears Crosstown building, which is a 1.5 million square foot historically listed building. A strange place to put in every use you can think of, but they're all there. Retail, office, housing, medical, arts groups, food fair, high school, college, probably forgetting some. It's the neatest mixed-use building I've ever worked on, and hopefully it all comes to fruition. When we started the project, we did a magnet study of the pieces we wanted to be in there, and maybe a little bit small on the left, but art, food, education, and wellness. And through the evolution of the design, we've actually had wellness as the prime piece, and all the other pieces feed into it. This is I should have included a slide that showed you a picture of the actual building because it's pretty cool, but this is an outline of the building and some of the studies we did. This is a plan view of the parking structure to the bottom of the slide and the building itself, its footprint. We also looked at the outdoor spaces as part of this whole concept and how to make sure that those spaces were active at all times. A section through that, just giving you some idea of the breadth of the building. It's a 10-story building through most of it, 14 on the east side. And obviously one of the biggest challenges is how to move around such a large structure. So we've got a very fascinating pathway, if you will, through the building to get people to connect. In Salinas, this is a very depressed city south of San Francisco. On the right and left of this are two neighborhoods. One is Hispanic, one is white. And this is the no man's land in between with a freeway and rail lines splitting it off from the city. What we're creating here is a magnet-based town, which is intended to join everything together. In Portland, we did a project connecting the Saturday market into the park. So on the right is the park in Portland that is along the river. We marched the market into the park, which was pretty controversial. But again, it was about engaging public space and making sure it worked. In Los Angeles, we've been involved for 7 years in a project that has been on hold for 5 of those, which is an amazing project right downtown. Currently, film studios on the site. What we've done is create a film magnet where we can film on the streets. We've got sets being made, we've got sound stages, but it's also a complete community. And it includes things like having movies played on the street. And that's it. Hopefully I'm not too far over time. Thank you very much.
I think zoning codes are very rigid. I've often said zoning codes are like Russian law. The way we designate zoning classifications and districts, then we then go to the land use table, and it tells you which zoning uses are permitted, excluding all other uses. So in Russian law, unless the law says you can do something, then you can't do it. So it prohibits you from doing maybe what the market is asking for, what the developer would want to do, and what the people would like to see. So we need to rethink zoning, and we've done a great deal of that in Nashville as far as encouraging mixed use, allowing mixed use developments, but we're still quite rigid in the way we allow you to use your property and the way we don't allow you to use your property.
And it's like generally the trends what you see with neighborhoods when they revitalize. You see certain businesses come in, take off, and there's an asymmetry that happens with other businesses, retail, some of the service businesses. It takes a little while for them to catch up. So if you can create that critical mass initially, you're better served, the neighborhood's better served. And then you can add and develop componentry as you go along. And I think it makes the stability curve just kind of stretch out a little bit longer. I mean, you saw that with Granville Island, is that it's adaptable and it's participatory. And I think that's just the basic tenet of the idea.
You know, one other thing that our committee really identified as something that was significant just within this framework for thinking about mixed use is specifically industrial use. And Alan touched on just the new industry, the new technologies that are shaping the way in which we make things, and also this the human affinity to be close to some of those kinds of activities where we see people that are not only selling items and crafts, but they're actually creating them to an audience of people who can participate in ways that you can in your standard kind of retail formats. I thought it'd be interesting because Alan, on a couple of occasions over the last couple of days, you've talked a little bit specifically with Vancouver and some of the obstacles that you see that touches on zoning challenges and perceptions. I just wanted to hear you comment a little bit more about industrial use and its role in the urban magnet model.
Thanks. Yeah, I could share with you one thing that's happened in Vancouver. My biggest argument of any jurisdiction I work in is in Vancouver, actually. There are parts of Vancouver that are zoned industrial, and they allow for work-based activity only. They don't allow for residential, they don't allow for retail. This is in a city that claims to want to be the greenest city in the world. It's in a city that has, as I said, no more land. And we have 3 or 4 areas of the city that have 2-story structures throughout. They may be reasonably dense industrial areas, but they certainly are not mixed-use areas. And they're places that you have to drive into because the transit doesn't go in there because there's not enough people there. So it's an argument that I've been having for a long time and made some progress, but not a lot. But interestingly, I mean, one thing I want to say is what I've seen in Nashville, usually when I go to a place, I have to discuss with people. The first question is, well, we don't have those kind of micro businesses. We don't have people wanting to be entrepreneurial. We don't have artisans. We don't have musicians. That is not the case here. I mean, I can't believe how many people are opening up a corner restaurant or a store or, you know, the streets that are lined with music industry businesses. There's incredible opportunity here to do exactly what I'm talking about.
You know, one thing that in line with that is that you're finding, and you find in the fabric of the city of Nashville, that these kinds of people, they by nature gravitate to a particular locality for various reasons, but one is the fact that they are participating in this kind of micro artisanal kind of industry. So you have artists, you have the people that are a little bit more kind of light industrial who feed off of the proximity. And you can see as we kind of tour through Nashville, these nodes. One of the things that's come up through conversations is just the role of transportation and thinking about this model, the urban magnets model on a city or a district level. And I was interested to hear maybe the panel talk a little bit about the role of transportation in connecting these nodes that are already evolving.
The issue of transportation is obviously probably the second most important issue that we're dealing with behind just education in general. And it's coming from a structure that is a city that's relatively low density and historically hasn't supported transit or made that available. So, I mean, I think it's going to be a critical component of where we want to go. I also, though, want to say I want to build a little bit on what was talked about the entrepreneurialism here and some of the changes, and maybe even issue a challenge to ULI. Picking up a little bit on what Terry said, I agree with Terry 100% that many of our zoning codes are absolutely rigid and well defined. I think over the last 8 to 10 years, we've been able to both change the planning culture away from use and numbers to character, which gets us into the discussion that we want to be, how do we build great places. But we also have been able to put together some zoning districts that at least have enabled that flexibility to go through. There's still processes, but the challenge really is working within a community that only are the citizens and even the elected council members, and I know there's some here, that tend to think in terms of the rigidity of historical zoning approaches, uses in districts and that type of thing. We've been able to create the great places, the Germantown and all that, by building on that diversity. And so how do we move to the next step where the process of creating that diversity is done in a way that will achieve that provides the flexibility for a developer, but also achieves the great public spaces. I mean, dealing with our back to transportation, our street system, it's probably the most difficult single issue that anybody in this room ever has to deal with, is dealing with a set of street standards that are fundamentally and totally inappropriate for an urban area. And if we're going to make any progress, we're going to have to deal with that issue. We're going to have to deal with that issue fundamentally and at the very core, or we'll never be able to create the great places. The debates that we have on sidewalks and how the building meets the street and all that is always secondary to how, after we make sure that we provide enough room for the automobiles. I mean, I don't know that there were any examples that you showed that we could ever get permitted here. And if there are people out there that have gotten some, I'd like to talk to you about how you did that. But I just think that we're kidding ourselves until we really open up our mind to the fact that this is an urban, mixed-use environment. To create great places, you've got to create them for people. They've got to be authentic, and we've got to kind of provide that flexibility. It takes a lot of time. We've gone a good portion of the way. We've just got to go the rest of the way.
Just on top of that, I think transportation is absolutely critical, and the statistic I found most interesting was how much more dense and more jobs and people are living in Vancouver, but the car congestion has gone down. And what I see is a real need to educate our citizens in Nashville to sort of make that connection with increased density on our urban arterials will make transportation possible, but also can reduce the congestion that we have by reducing the number of car trips that are necessary. So, and that's what's going to make getting around in the future, when we have 1 million more people here, possible without just continuing to have to sprawl. We've got some innovative transportation projects here recently. I think our downtown circulator system and how that will grow in the future. Some of our new connector routes that are happening. The idea of not just being a spoke system, but how do you connect around the circle? Some of our neighborhood routes, like we have in Madison, and the new University Connector starts to that. But more density is absolutely necessary, and we can improve the quality of our life here by looking at all our pikes and preserving also the great neighborhoods that we have in between, but strategically doing infill development in those. And so it's not just the transportation approach, it's looking at housing, new food resources, open spaces, and how all those connect together to make a complete system.
Questions from the audience that we could pose to the panel? Yeah, go ahead, Gary.
I'd love to hear more of the fourth element in making a magnet, the programming element. Great slide behind you. What in Vancouver and in other places, what is the formula for someone always thinking about what's happening next in the street? Who's doing that? Is there an agency? Is it something you talk a little bit more about that? I think that's something Nashville, we've got some great spaces, but in terms of programming in a normal manner, to activate it with people is something that's an element we'd love to know more about.
Yeah, I guess overall there's a couple of things that are helpful. One is the planning department sees it as their mandate to make sure the street public spaces and the street interface are working. And they do that by pressuring the designer and the development team to make sure that they look at that. There's a design panel in Vancouver that has to review every significant project, and that's one of the criteria they apply. And if they vote at the end of that meeting that the project's not moving forward, you go back to go, essentially. So those are important. In terms of the programming, though, the slide you see behind you is largely due to our firm. We made sure, you can see maybe in the middle there was a TV screen from the broadcaster that was available to put that image out on the street. We picked the public art in the coffee shop. We made the band. That's all on this site. So, you need to have the design community understand the concept first, because I think they can be a big driver of making sure these things work. But you need the whole community in the planning department to also understand the value of it.
In looking at your concrete plant, which has been running around my head for the last 45 minutes, is Phillips Metals. I mean,
well, one, Terry and I were talking about that.
I would argue that you don't build around it. You could incorporate parts of it possibly, but you can't. It's 110 acres. I mean, Granville Island is what, 35 acres?
Total, yeah.
So I mean, there's no way to create what you're talking about by building around that. If there was a part of that you could incorporate that in, a compacting part or some element, I think that would be positive. But I just don't see incorporating that entire 110 acres into anything that would make any sense.
I've been to Vancouver. My son went to University of Vancouver. British Columbia, and it's the culture. I mean, he lived there for several years, and he didn't have a car, and it didn't bother him. And he lived in North Vancouver, and the culture there is completely different than the culture here. I mean, when they talk about density, and getting back to what Rick was talking about in terms of transportation, everybody worries about, we put this density here, how are we going to park all the cars? That is, and I live and work in Franklin, and they're going through a whole catharsis of redoing their parking regulations. And the whole thing is we got to accommodate the car. And that's a culture. And the culture in Vancouver, like you said, is people can live without a car. But here you cannot live without a car. And how do you change that culture? I mean, my son was there 10 years ago, and the culture was there 10 years ago.
Yeah, but it didn't happen overnight, and I don't think a city like Nashville or many American cities is going to abandon the car overnight. The first towers that were built in Vancouver, and many even today, are built with a lot of parking. However, the parking is underground. I mean, that was one thing I didn't like as I walked around the city yesterday, is that as the car changes and evolves and our thinking changes about it, I mean, even from a development point of view, you've got 7 or 8 floors that should be units that are for sale or for rent. So I know it's a little more expensive to go underground, but it's the wrong thing to do to put them above ground. But in Vancouver, we evolved over time, and the development community was the last to evolve in a sense. But when they realized they were spending $50,000 a stall underground to build these things, and no one was putting cars in them, they pretty quickly abandoned that idea. But you have to do all the things first. You have to have density. You have to have great places. You probably need some transit, and then that tipping point happens where the car diminishes in its usage. You won't get there overnight.
as we start to take back our riverfronts, I think that our industrialized riverfront along the Cumberland looks a lot like Granville Island did back in the 70s. Is there any advice you could give to Nashville as we start to redo our riverfronts and really start to care about our riverfronts again, and since we've previously abandoned them to industrialization?
I guess I don't know the area well, so it's difficult to comment. But I would say don't abandon, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are probably elements of that industrial past that can be retained and kept, and there's probably things that can't be. That site that was mentioned is way too big. It would, you need some core component of that to keep and prosper through time. So be careful, judge what stays and what doesn't.
I want to throw on top of that, I mean, if you go along the greenway that's north of downtown, it passes by a concrete plant, which is, I've seen some great images of one of the mayor's walks, and people were walking past that concrete plant, but it's in between downtown and Germantown, as it's expanding towards the river. I mean, that's an opportunity for us to keep some of the industrial uses, the mechanical uses that are in the city, but also we've seen some of the sites in Germantown have evolved into housing, and I think that will definitely continue to happen. But whenever possible, you can keep some of those buildings on site and re-inhabit them, and that also provides the affordability component, because obviously it's cheaper to keep a building sometimes. So just to have that woven into a neighborhood wherever possible, I think is a good way to approach that. And the spaces, Brent, over in East Nashville are just fantastic. To me, they bring that vitality. They're small and they're new, but they're affordable.
But I'd love for Brent to comment a little bit more in terms of what these elements that we're talking about and how all that came together for you and your learning curve as you began to step out of the mold and do something different, which has really become successful.
Well, the evolution of our existence in East Nashville is we bought a building from the city in 2000. It used to host Bailey's Wrecking Service, or it was originally Bailey's Wrecking Service, and then the city took it over, and it was the DA Drug Sting Task Force for how many years. And then my wife and I started an art gallery in there. I had been a design builder for years. I did a lot of entertainment stuff, a lot of film work. So I had a lot of workspace, and then we started this gallery. As the gallery got off its feet, we would have incredible turnouts to shows. We'd have potentially 600 to 1,000 people for an art gallery opening in East Nashville. You see people from the west side of town kind of introducing themselves to the east side of town. It was pretty wonderful. And then over time, we initiated something called the Tomato Art Festival, which gets a tremendous amount of press. But my wife and I have always kind of held that as a private endeavor, shared with the community, and we put it out there where it's not driven necessarily by alcohol sales or other types of sponsorship. It'll change over time, but the goal had always been to open up the opportunities with that festival, for as unique as it is, to draw out people, neighbors, so they could participate in the recipe contest and in the parade, and so it could be the youngest neighborhood member and a resident and the oldest neighborhood resident. So this past year, it was its 9th year, and we had an attendance of approximately 35 to 40,000 people come. And I mean, people dress up, it's pretty unique. And so watching that, the gallery evolve and having our ear to the ground there, we were able to just kind of hear of what people would want to do, what they would want to attempt. And so when you think about artists as the smallest unit of small business, you think, okay, if that can start here and if we can work and they can become stronger, how does that extrapolate out? How does it extrapolate out? And how do you go from there? Well, interimly, and this is one of the ways that I met Rick and Terry, is that just as a traffic driver, and it's a bit of a novelty, I built a hot dog stand called I Dream of Weenie. And it took me probably 35 face-to-face meetings with Metro, because it's in a historic overlay and this and that. But I mean, if you understand novelty, it'll attract. You have to kind of keep it in a certain realm. But the strength in it is, for something that was 6 feet by 12 feet, it attracted probably 30,000 customers a year, if not more. So when you start thinking about building traffic and having things that people can participate in, and just the way that people do participate in, this was something, and I think I came in to present it, well, right after the Westin was presented. And so it looked like they had been through the ringer. And so I walked in to present something about that dream of weenie. And I had a partner who was in the antique shop, my friend Wayne Goodwin. He was with Stuckey's for 25 years. And so we thought, okay, let's see if we can get away with this. So anyhow, one of the things with I Dream of Weenie being a mobile stand is the rules, the regulations said you couldn't have seating. And I just remember Rick going, do you remember what you said? That's stupid.
Yeah.
Anyhow, so the way that we made it work is we put out picnic blankets, and you'd see all walks of life come up there and participate. So you see every ethnicity, you'd see young and old, and it was wonderful. They weren't intimidated by the change of the neighborhood. And it's the same kind of spirit the festival had. Now, when I got into doing the incubator was something that, after watching East Nashville over the years, the number of vacant lots just in probably a 3 or 4 block area, it numbered about 7. And the market had been going up to 2008, and you would think, and you'd see placard go up and be this thing or that thing. And it just, you know, for our experience watching what was available, we just tried to draw out what was available. So I thought that I would design, and I did my own plan, and I made a little model. And Billy Fields, who was with the mayor's neighborhood office at the time, was a friend of ours because he had helped with the Tomato Festival. Long story short, he made arrangements for me to sit with Terry Cobb and Manly Biggers and Joey Hargis. So that was the head of codes, head of zoning, and inspectors. And Terry took the time, and he kindly looked at it and said it was possible. So, I mean, that was very encouraging. And the model that I have at the Idea Hatchery, which is my little village, is semi-permanent. It has a lifespan of maybe 15 to 20 years. The buildings are built on piers, so it's a little unusual. The debates that we had with historic were the things that extended the period of time in terms of getting it off the ground. Now, it was fully occupied. I had a waiting list of approximately 80. The spaces run from 168 square feet up to 320 square feet. I handle it as a true incubator. So my goal is, it's not like I'm hosting Starbucks. I want people to feel like it's possible. I want them to step up and attempt something and wrestle with it a year. I do a year lease, reasonable rent. And that started in 2010. Now, at the end of 2010, when I finished the construction was done, I was approached by a gentleman in East Nashville named Mark Sanders. He owned property on Fatherland Street, and it was probably just shy of an acre. And so he asked me if I would be interested in working to facilitate a similar model, but a broader model. So what we try to do, since just looking at what was available, is to grow the model where it would be more of a permanent thing, put it in place where you could create entry level and then work towards trending the scale of the businesses upward. And so starting from scratch in East Nashville, and it's not really starting from scratch, it's just the kind of the flow of how development happens. You have your restaurants, your bars. We just want to put things in place so the individual is not entirely excluded if the scale or if bigger and outside money came in. So if that's in place, I feel like that can drive economically. And Al and I were talking about this yesterday, is that on the scale it's applicable as a neighborhood driver, probably universally. In an affluent neighborhood or in a marginal neighborhood. It can either preserve opportunity or it can encourage opportunity. And so I look at it a little bit differently, but it's been it's been enlightening to be around this gang and over the years with Terry and Rick.
Thanks so much, Brad. It's a good story. It's always good to hear kind of a testimony.
There you go.
We're kind of getting close to the end. We may have one more question that can be quickly addressed if we have one in the audience.
I have sort of a point to make. I have 2 small children. I love nothing more than to park my car, come live downtown, and be in that sort of urban environment. But we don't have, we can't do that. I mean, first of all, the units are 1 bedroom studio apartments. I can afford them anyway, even if it was a bigger space. Plus, where would they go to school? So it's, I mean, it's sort of like, it seems like we're kind of moving toward the urban residential, but you're only gonna get people who don't have kids or sort of the empty nesters, maybe who are downsizing. So how do you sort of address the families? And I know you had mentioned that, and is there a way we can sort of talk about that?
My big thing right now is a downtown school. We've looked at models. Chattanooga has a fantastic one, and that is the missing segment, I think, and it's a demographic that we need to capture, and hopefully can do it well in downtown Nashville. If you come in as a young professional and you get married and you start having kids, typically what's happening is you're moving out to either an urban community or a suburban community. So how can we bring in a product and a model for a demographic that we don't have right now in downtown? And I think you're absolutely right. It has to be a focused, something that we look at as a city and make it a priority. And I think that there's innovative private-public partnerships that we can do, so that it's not just the school system that has to say, we have to take this on as a part of our budget, but how can we look at getting developers involved, foundations, and really making it something that adds to the vitality of our downtown community and surrounding urban neighborhoods.
We've made some mistakes in Nashville in our past. My favorite mistake that we've made is up until the year 2000 or 2001, it was illegal to build residential downtown. Okay? And everybody was saying, why don't we have residential downtown? That would be cool. And then we figured out we'd change the zoning code to allow residential, and then residential opportunities started popping up everywhere. So our first real venture into residential was about 10, 11 years ago. So we've made some very positive changes. We're not quite there yet, but we're on our way. Our zoning code now encourages downtown residential, and they're still coming.
Just one other thing, because our zoning code does not generally, up until just a few years ago, allow residential on the corridors either, or on the pikes. And we were able to change that, at least in parts of the city. There's still a lot of the city that's zoned commercial that does not allow residential. If you're in the urban zoning overlay, you can have residential on the pikes. But that's the next big issue too. Why we didn't allow residential on the pikes and why we don't allow residential downtown was beyond my comprehension.
So I think this is maybe a chance just to wrap things up. I do want to make it known that the intent from the committee from the get-go was to see these two events, these Urban Magnet events, both in February and now, would stimulate multiple more focused and targeted conversations where we're bringing stakeholders together to really wrestle through some of these principles, these plans in specific localities, and really start getting into some actionable kind of items and really, make this an operative movement. So our committee is kind of at this point still talking about how we're going to go about doing that. We wanted to have this event to kind of soak it in, digest it, think about it. We'll continue to work probably with some of these panel members to help us with those next steps to do that. So I just want to let you know that that's going to be a ULI initiative that's going to continue as we go from here. And with that, I just want to again thank you for being here. Thank you for ULI and Emma for allowing us to use this space, and have a great day.